The restaurant looked calm from the outside, but inside it carried a quiet kind of pressure. Soft lights reflected off polished tables, and the gentle sound of a piano filled the room. It was the kind of place where people came to feel important, to celebrate, or to forget their worries for a few hours. Every detail mattered, the arrangement of plates, the timing of service, even the volume of the music. She moved carefully between the tables, balancing a tray with steady hands. Her steps were light, almost invisible, like she didn't want to disturb anything. Most people didn't notice her. To them, she was just part of the background, like the music or the dim lights. But she noticed everything. The nervous couple on their first date, the family celebrating something big, the man sitting alone staring at his phone. Her shift had started hours ago, and her feet already ached, but she didn't show it. She had learned to keep her face calm, her voice polite, and her movements smooth. It wasn't just a job for her. It was survival. Every tip mattered. Every shift counted. The piano in the corner was always there, played by a man who came in every evening. His music wasn't loud or flashy, but it gave the room a steady heartbeat. She often found herself listening for a second longer than she should, just before turning back to her work. Something about the sound stayed with her, even when she tried to ignore it. That evening felt like any other, until the doors opened again. A small wave of attention moved across the room. Heads turned, conversations paused, and even the staff seemed to stand a little straighter. A man had walked in, dressed sharply, carrying the kind of confidence that didn't need to be announced. He didn't rush. He didn't look around much. He simply walked in like he belonged there. People recognized him, even if they pretended not to stare. Wealth had a way of making itself known without words. She noticed the shift immediately. The manager stepped forward quickly, greeting him with extra care. A table was prepared for him near the center of the room, the best spot in the house. Everything around him seemed to adjust, like the entire restaurant had quietly decided he mattered more than anyone else that night. She picked up a glass of water and walked toward his table. Her movements didn't change, even though she could feel the difference in the air. She had served all kinds of people before. Some kind, some rude, some forgettable, but she treated them all the same. As she placed the glass down, he barely looked at her. His attention was somewhere else, maybe on his phone, maybe on his thoughts. It didn't bother her. She wasn't there to be noticed. But something else was about to change. A sudden pause in the music caught her attention. The piano had stopped. It was subtle at first, like a missing breath. A few people looked toward the corner, confused. The pianist had stood up, speaking quietly to one of the staff members. Within moments, he picked up his coat and left, leaving the piano behind. The room felt different without the music. Conversations grew slightly louder, but the balance was gone. It was like something important had quietly disappeared. The manager looked worried. A restaurant like this wasn't supposed to have silence like that. Not tonight. Not with someone important sitting in the center of the room. For a few minutes, the staff tried to carry on as normal. Plates were served, drinks were poured, and people continued talking. But the missing music hung in the air, noticeable even to those who didn't realize why. Then, unexpectedly, the man at the center leaned back in his chair and glanced toward the piano. "Is there no music tonight?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to be heard. The manager stepped forward quickly, explaining in a careful tone that the pianist had to leave unexpectedly. There was a hint of apology in every word. The man nodded slightly, as if considering something. Then his eyes moved across the room, not in a searching way, but almost casually. And then, for a brief moment, they landed on her. She had just turned away from another table, holding an empty tray, when she felt it. That subtle shift when attention finds you. "Can anyone else play?" he asked, his tone light, almost amused. There was a small pause. The manager hesitated. A few staff members exchanged quick looks, unsure of what to say. It should have ended there, but it didn't. His gaze returned to her, and there was a slight smile on his face. Not kind, not cruel, just curious. "What about her?" he said, gesturing lightly in her direction. "She looks like she could try." For a second, She thought she had misunderstood. People nearby turned to look at her, some with interest, others with quiet amusement. A few even smiled, as if expecting a joke. She stood still, holding the tray, unsure whether to speak or simply walk away. The manager quickly stepped in, trying to laugh it off, saying she was just a waitress, not a musician. But the man didn't seem convinced. If anything, he looked more entertained now. "Come on," he said, not loudly, but enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Just a few notes. It might be fun." The word fun hung in the air, but it didn't feel light. More people were watching now. Conversations had slowed. Some guests leaned back in their chairs, curious to see what would happen. Others whispered quietly, already forming opinions. She felt the weight of their eyes, the quiet pressure building around her. This wasn't part of her job. This wasn't something she had expected when she walked in that evening. For a moment she considered refusing. It would be easy. She could smile politely, say she didn't know how, and return to her work. Most people would forget about it in minutes. But something inside her didn't move. Her hands tightened slightly around the tray. The room felt louder and quieter at the same time. She could hear her own breathing, steady but deeper than usual. Memories flickered in the back of her mind, uninvited. A different room, a different time, fingers pressing down on keys. Long hours of practice, a voice encouraging her to keep going. Then silence. Years of silence. She had buried that part of herself a long time ago. Life had taken over. Responsibilities had replaced dreams. And slowly, the music had faded into something distant. But now, standing there with everyone watching, it didn't feel so distant anymore. The manager gave her a quick look, one that said she didn't have to do this, that she could walk away. The man at the table waited, still relaxed, still slightly amused, as if this was just a small moment in his evening. And the room was waiting. She took a slow breath. Then, without saying anything, she placed the tray down on a nearby counter. A small ripple of surprise moved through the room. She wiped her hands lightly on her apron, more out of habit than need. Her steps were slow as she walked toward the piano, but they were steady. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because she was unsure, but because she knew exactly what she was doing. When she reached the piano, she paused for a moment. The chair was still slightly warm from the last player. The keys sat quietly, untouched, waiting. She sat down gently. The room had grown quieter now. Even those who had been whispering had stopped. There was something about the moment that felt different, uncertain but important. Her hands hovered above the keys. For a second, she didn't move. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because she was remembering how it felt. The world outside seemed to fade just a little. Then, very softly, her fingers lowered. The first note hadn't been played yet, but something had already changed. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, but she still hadn't pressed them down. The silence in the room felt heavier now, no longer empty but filled with expectation. Every second stretched longer than it should. People leaned forward in their chairs, watching closely, waiting for something, anything to happen. She could feel it all. The attention, the doubt, the quiet amusement from a few corners of the room. It pressed against her, testing her, asking if she really belonged there. For a brief moment her hands almost pulled away. It had been a long time, not days or weeks but years. Years since she had last sat in front of a piano like this, with nothing else to think about except the music. Back then, things had been different. Life had been simpler in some ways, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. She remembered a small room with a worn-out piano pushed against the wall. The keys weren't perfect, and a few notes sounded slightly off, but it didn't matter. She used to sit there for hours, repeating the same piece again and again until her fingers moved without hesitation. There had been no audience back then, no pressure to prove anything. Just her and the sound. A quiet voice used to guide her. Not loud, not strict, but steady. Telling her to slow down. To feel the music, not just play it. To let every note mean something. She hadn't thought about those moments in a long time. Life had moved fast after that. things changed. Responsibilities grew heavier. There were bills to pay, problems to solve, and choices to make. The piano became less important, then slowly disappeared from her daily life. At first, she told herself it was temporary, that she would come back to it when things got better. But later kept moving further away. The last time she had played properly, she still remembered it clearly. The room, the light, the way her hands had moved without fear. It had felt like something was opening inside her. And then, just like that, it was gone. Now, sitting here again, all those memories came rushing back, mixing with the present in a way that made her chest feel tight. The restaurant around her felt distant, even though she knew everyone was watching. She took a slow breath. Her fingers finally pressed down. The first note was soft. So soft that, for a second, it almost disappeared into the air. A few people in the room shifted slightly, unsure if that was the beginning or just a mistake. Then came the second note. And the third. They were simple, careful, almost cautious. Like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground, testing each step before moving forward. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Some guests exchanged looks, their earlier curiosity turning into mild disappointment. It wasn't impressive, not yet. At the center table, the man watched with a small, knowing smile, as if this was exactly what he had expected. Just a waitress trying something beyond her place, proving nothing. But she didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the keys. Her hands moved slowly, building a small pattern, repeating it once, then again. The notes were steady even if they were simple. There was no rush in her playing, no attempt to impress. And then, something shifted. It wasn't obvious at first. The notes began to connect more smoothly. The pauses between them grew shorter. Her fingers started to move with a little more confidence, like they were remembering something they had almost forgotten. The sound changed. It was still quiet, but it carried more weight now. More intention. A few people who had started to lose interest turned back toward the piano. She could feel it too. That familiar feeling, slowly returning. Her hands relaxed slightly, and with that, the music began to breathe. The simple pattern grew into something fuller. The melody stretched out, finding its shape. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. She wasn't thinking about the room anymore. She wasn't thinking about the man who had challenged her. She wasn't even thinking about herself. She was just playing. Another memory surfaced, clearer this time. A day when everything had felt possible. When she had believed, truly believed, that music could be her future. That the long hours, the effort, the sacrifices would lead somewhere meaningful. She had held onto that belief for a long time, until life had asked her to choose. And she had chosen survival. The music grew stronger. Not louder, but deeper. Each note carried something more now. Something that didn't need explanation. It wasn't about skill anymore. It was about feeling. The room began to change. The soft clinking of glasses faded. Conversations slowed, then stopped. Even those who had been laughing earlier fell quiet without realizing it. People started to listen. Really listen. At the center table, the man's smile faded slightly. His posture shifted, just a little. He leaned forward, his attention no longer casual. This wasn't what he had expected. Her fingers moved more freely now, no longer careful or hesitant. The music flowed, rising and falling in a way that felt natural, like it had been waiting for this moment. There was a sadness in it, not heavy or overwhelming, but present. A quiet kind of sadness that didn't ask for attention, but made itself felt anyway. It told a story without words, of something lost, of something remembered, of something that had never fully disappeared. She didn't notice the change in the room, but it was happening. A waiter stood still near the kitchen entrance, forgetting what he had been about to do. A couple at a corner table stopped mid-conversation, their eyes fixed on the piano. Even the manager, who had been worried just moments ago, now stood quietly, watching with a different expression. The music filled the space that had once felt empty, and it fit perfectly. The man at the center table was no longer leaning back. His arms rested on the table now, his gaze steady, focused. The amusement was gone, replaced by something harder to define. Respect, maybe, or surprise, or both. She continued playing, unaware of all of it. Her world had narrowed to the piano, to the keys beneath her fingers, to the sound that was growing stronger with every passing second. The hesitation from the beginning had disappeared completely. Now there was only certainty. Not the loud, confident kind, but something quieter and stronger. The kind that comes from knowing something deeply, even after years of silence. Her hands moved across the keys with ease, shifting between notes without pause. The melody expanded, reaching further, pulling the listener in. Time felt different now, slower, heavier, more meaningful. And in that moment, no one in the room cared that she was a waitress. No one cared about titles or roles or expectations. There was only the music, and the person creating it. She pressed another set of notes, slightly stronger this time, and the sound carried across the room with a clarity that made a few people take a quiet breath. It was no longer background music. It had become the center of everything. The man at the table lowered his gaze for a second, then looked back at her, as if trying to understand how he had been so wrong just moments ago. But she didn't see it. She didn't see any of it. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't playing for anyone else. She was playing for herself. And she hadn't finished yet. The music continued to grow, but not in a rushed or dramatic way. It unfolded slowly, like a story being told with care. Her hands moved across the keys with a quiet confidence now, no longer searching, no longer unsure. Each note followed the next naturally, as if they had always been there, just waiting to be heard again. The room had changed completely. No one was speaking anymore. Even the smallest sounds had disappeared. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels empty or awkward. It was full, filled with attention, with feeling, with something that held everyone in place. A man who had been checking his phone earlier now had it resting face down on the table. A group of friends who had been laughing moments ago sat still, their expressions softer, their focus entirely on the piano. A couple near the window held their hands together without even realizing it, their conversation forgotten. It was as if time had paused for everyone at once. She sat in the middle of it all, unaware of the stillness she had created. Her posture had changed slightly. She was no longer sitting like someone trying to get through a moment. Now she looked like she belonged there. Her back was straight, her shoulders relaxed, her head slightly tilted as she listened to the sound she was creating. Her fingers moved faster now, but not carelessly. There was control in every movement, a balance between precision and feeling that couldn't be forced. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that didn't rely on practice alone. The melody shifted again. What had started soft and careful had turned into something fuller, richer. There were layers now, notes rising and falling together, creating a sound that wrapped around the room. It carried emotion in a way that words never could. A quiet intensity built within the music. Not loud, not overwhelming, but strong enough to be felt by everyone listening. At the center table, the man sat completely still. The earlier amusement was gone without a trace. His expression had changed into something more serious, more focused. He wasn't watching out of curiosity anymore. He was listening, really listening. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on her hands as they moved across the keys. There was a small crease in his forehead, not from confusion, but from concentration. It was the look of someone trying to understand something unexpected. He had seen many performances before. Expensive concerts, private shows, carefully planned entertainment meant to impress people like him. But this was different. There was no stage, no spotlight, no introduction. And yet, it held more power than anything he had planned for that evening. Across the room, the manager stood near the entrance, his earlier worry completely replaced by quiet disbelief. He had worked there for years, seen countless nights come and go, but never something like this. The restaurant didn't feel like a restaurant anymore. Felt like something else, something rare. She continued playing, her hands moving with more energy now. The music began to rise, building towards something stronger. The notes carried a quiet urgency, as if they had something important to say. Another memory passed through her mind, but this one didn't slow her down. Pushed her forward. Late nights spent practicing while the rest of the world slept. Fingers sore, but refusing to stop. Small mistakes repeated until they disappeared. A quiet determination that didn't need anyone else to see it. She had once given everything to this. And even after all this time, that part of her hadn't gone away. It had just been waiting. The melody climbed higher. The sound became brighter, stronger, filling every corner of the room. It reached people in ways they didn't expect, pulling them deeper into the moment. A woman near the back blinked slowly, her eyes slightly glossy, though she didn't know why. A man sitting alone straightened in his chair, his expression softer than before. Even the staff, trained to keep moving no matter what, stood still for just a second longer than they should. The music connected them, not in a loud or obvious way but quietly, deeply. Her fingers moved faster now, gliding across the keys with a smoothness that came from instinct. There was no hesitation left, no doubt, only movement, only sound, only feeling. The man at the center table exhaled slowly, almost without realizing it. His hands, which had been resting on the table, now clasped together lightly. He wasn't thinking about status or control or expectation anymore. He was simply there, listening. For perhaps the first time that evening, he wasn't the most important person in the room. And he knew it. The music shifted again, this time softer, pulling back slightly after its rise. It didn't end the intensity, but it changed its shape. It became more personal, more reflective, felt like a conversation, like something being said quietly, directly to anyone willing to hear it. She leaned into it, her touch on the keys gentler now, but just as certain. The notes carried a different kind of emotion, less urgency, more understanding. It wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was simply real. The room held onto every note. No one moved. No one interrupted. It was as if everyone understood, without being told, that this moment mattered, that it couldn't be broken. She played a sequence of notes that lingered slightly longer in the air, letting them settle before moving forward. Created a small pause, a breath within the music itself. And in that pause, the silence of the room became even more powerful. Because now it wasn't just the absence of sound. It was part of the music. She continued, her hands steady, her expression calm. There was no sign of the hesitation from earlier. No trace of the uncertainty that had followed her to the piano. That version of her was gone. This version was different, stronger, clearer, present. The man's gaze softened as he watched her. Not with judgment, not with expectation, but with something closer to respect. The kind that isn't given easily. The kind that has to be earned without asking. And she had done that, without a single word, without even trying. The music began to build again, slowly, carefully, like a wave gathering strength. It hinted at something more, something still to come. The room seemed to lean into it, as if everyone could feel that the moment wasn't over yet, that there was more waiting beneath the surface. Her fingers pressed down with slightly more force, bringing out a stronger sound. The melody deepened, pulling the listeners further in. No one looked away. No one wanted to, because what was happening in that moment couldn't be repeated, couldn't be planned, couldn't be replaced. And as her hands continued to move across the keys, carrying the music forward, one thing became clear to everyone in the room. This was no longer a simple performance. It had become something unforgettable. The music didn't stop, kept moving forward, growing in a way that felt natural, like it knew exactly where it was going. Her hands were no longer just playing notes. They were telling something deeper, something that didn't need words to be understood. The room was completely still now. Not a single voice, not a single distraction. Even the smallest sounds, chairs shifting, glasses touching the table, had disappeared. It felt almost unreal, like the entire space was holding its breath at the same time. She leaned slightly closer to the piano, her focus absolute. Her fingers moved with more strength now, pressing the keys with a confidence that filled the room. The melody rose higher, carrying a kind of energy that made people sit straighter without realizing it. There was something powerful in it. Not loud or overwhelming, but steady and undeniable. It reached into the room and held on to everyone there. A man near the window slowly placed his fork down, his attention fully taken. A group at the far table, who had been strangers to each other just moments ago, now sat in shared silence, connected by the same sound. Even the staff, trained to move quickly and quietly, had paused in places they normally wouldn't. It wasn't forced. It just happened. At the center table, the man's expression had changed completely. There was no trace of amusement left. His posture was different too, upright, attentive, almost still. His eyes followed her hands, not in a critical way, but with quiet focus. The kind of focus that comes when someone realizes they are witnessing something real. He had expected a short moment of entertainment, maybe a few awkward notes, maybe something to laugh about later, but this was something else entirely. His gaze softened slightly, though he didn't realize it himself. There was a quiet shift inside him, something small but important. The kind of shift that happens when expectations break and something unexpected takes their place. She didn't see any of it. Her world was still centered on the piano. Her hands moved faster now, but every movement was controlled. There was no rushing, no panic. The speed came naturally, like a river flowing stronger as it moves forward. The melody built into something fuller, more layered. It rose and fell, carrying moments of tension and release, like a conversation between different parts of her story. There were notes that felt strong and certain, followed by softer ones that felt reflective, almost quiet. It wasn't just music. Felt like truth, and people could feel it. A woman sitting near the middle of the room blinked slowly, her eyes focused but distant at the same time, as if the music had taken her somewhere else. A man who had been seated alone leaned back slightly, his face calm in a way it hadn't been before. No one spoke. No one needed to. The music was enough. She pressed into a stronger section now, her fingers moving with precision across the keys. The sound became more intense, filling every part of the space without being overwhelming. It carried emotion in a way that made it impossible to ignore. It demanded attention, but not in a forceful way. In a real way. The manager stood near the side, completely still, his earlier worries long forgotten. He wasn't thinking about service or timing anymore. He wasn't thinking about the business at all. He was simply listening. And in that moment he understood something clearly. This night would not be remembered for the food or the guests. It would be remembered for this. The music shifted again, moving into a deeper tone. It slowed slightly, not losing energy but changing direction. Felt more personal now, more focused, like it had reached a point where it didn't need to prove anything anymore. It simply existed. Her shoulders relaxed just a little as her hands softened on the keys. The notes carried a quiet weight, something that settled into the room rather than rising above it. Felt closer, more human, more real. At the center table, the man's eyes lowered for a brief moment, then returned to her. His face was calm, but there was something behind it now, something thoughtful. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was reflecting. The earlier moment, his challenge, his tone, the way he had pointed her out. It all felt distant now, almost out of place compared to what was happening in front of him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move. He simply stayed where he was, letting the moment continue. The music carried on, steady and sure. Her fingers moved with ease, no hesitation, no doubt. The connection between her and the piano felt complete now, like nothing had ever been broken, like no time had passed at all. It was as if this had always been part of her, and it had just been waiting for the right moment to return. The melody began to rise again, slowly building towards something stronger. There was a sense of direction now, like it was heading somewhere important. People felt it. They leaned into it without realizing. Their attention sharpened, their focus deeper than before. The room remained silent, but it wasn't empty. It was full of anticipation. She pressed into the keys with more strength, and the sound responded, clear and powerful. It moved through the air with confidence, filling every corner of the space. It reached everyone, and no one looked away. A quiet tension built, not uncomfortable, but meaningful. It held the room together, connecting every person in that shared moment. The music felt alive, not perfect, not polished in a rehearsed way, but alive in a way that mattered more. Her hands moved faster now, but still controlled, still precise. The notes came together in a way that felt complete, like everything that had come before was leading to this point. The man at the center table took a slow breath, his eyes steady. He understood now. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that this moment was not something he could measure or control. Enough to know that he had been wrong. And he accepted it quietly. The music began to soften again, just slightly. Not ending, not fading, but preparing. There was a sense that something important was close, that the moment was reaching its peak. And the entire room felt it. Every person, every breath, every second. All of it held together by the sound of her playing. And in that stillness, in that shared silence that had taken over everything, one thing became clear. No one would forget this. Not the way it started. Not the way it changed. And not the way it made them feel. The music slowly began to settle. It didn't end suddenly or with a dramatic finish. Instead, it softened step by step, like a long breath being released after being held for too long. Her fingers moved more gently now, pressing the keys with care, letting each note fade naturally into the next. The room stayed completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. It felt like everyone understood, without needing to say it, that the ending mattered just as much as everything that came before. Her hands slowed even more. The final notes came quietly, but they carried a weight that stayed in the air even after the sound itself disappeared. She let the last note linger just a little longer, her fingers resting on the keys before lifting them away. And then, silence. Not the ordinary kind. Not the kind filled with distractions or movement. This silence felt full. It held everything the music had just created. It wrapped around the room, keeping everyone exactly where they were. For a brief moment, no one reacted. It was as if people needed time to return to where they were, to remember that they were sitting in a restaurant, surrounded by others. Then slowly it happened. A single clap, clear and sharp in the quiet, came from somewhere near the middle of the room. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. Not polite, not forced, real, strong. The kind that comes without thinking. People clapped longer than usual, louder than expected. Some even stood up without realizing it, their eyes still fixed on her. She sat there for a second, still facing the piano, as if she hadn't fully come back yet. The sound of the applause reached her slowly, like something distant at first, then clearer. She blinked once, then gently pushed her chair back. As she stood, the applause didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. But she didn't smile widely or wave or take a bow. She simply turned slightly, giving a small, respectful nod, her expression calm. There was no need to say anything. The music had already said everything. At the center table, the man was still seated, but his hands were now part of the applause. Not slowly, not out of obligation, but fully. His expression was different now. There was no trace of the earlier confidence that had filled the room when he first walked in. That version of him, the one who had made the challenge so casually, felt distant now. He watched her with a steady gaze, something thoughtful behind his eyes. When the applause finally began to settle, the room slowly returned to motion. People shifted in their seats, some exchanging quiet words, others simply shaking their heads in disbelief. But the feeling didn't disappear. It stayed, like something that had quietly changed inside the room. She stepped away from the piano, her movements simple, unhurried. As she walked back toward the service area, a few guests looked at her differently now. Not as someone blending into the background, but as someone they had just witnessed in a completely new way. Respect had replaced indifference. Curiosity had replaced assumption. She picked up the tray she had left behind earlier, almost as if she were returning to something familiar. Her hands were steady again, her expression calm, but there was something softer in her eyes, something lighter. The manager approached her quickly, his voice low but filled with surprise. That was... He paused, searching for the right words, then gave up and simply shook his head. I didn't know. She gave a small nod, not trying to explain. There wasn't much to say. Some things didn't need to be explained. Across the room, a few guests were still talking about it quietly, their voices carrying a mix of admiration and disbelief. One person gestured toward the piano. Another replayed the moment in their mind, trying to understand how it had happened so suddenly. But at the center table, the man remained quiet. He hadn't returned to his phone. He hadn't resumed his meal. He simply sat there, looking down at the table for a moment before lifting his gaze again. Then, after a brief pause, he stood up. The movement caught a few people's attention, though no one spoke. He adjusted his jacket slightly, then began to walk. Not toward the exit, but toward her. Each step was steady, not rushed, not hesitant. When he reached her, she had just finished placing a tray down on a nearby counter. She turned slightly, noticing him, her expression neutral. For a second, neither of them spoke. The moment felt different now, balanced, equal. I didn't expect that, he said finally, his voice quieter than before. There was no edge to it, no hint of challenge, just honesty. She looked at him, then gave a small nod. Most people don't, she replied simply. Her tone wasn't defensive or proud, just calm. He let out a short breath, almost like a quiet laugh, though it didn't fully form. That wasn't just playing, he said, his eyes steady. That was something else. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the tray slightly, as if grounding herself back in the moment. It's been a long time, she said after a pause. There was no explanation beyond that, but it was enough. He seemed to understand, or at least he understood enough to stop asking. For a moment he glanced toward the piano, then back at her. You stopped, he said, more to himself than to her. She followed his gaze briefly, then looked back at him. Yes. He didn't ask why. Some questions didn't need answers. Instead, he nodded once, slowly. Well, he said, straightening slightly. You shouldn't have. There was no command in his voice, no expectation, just a simple statement. She didn't react strongly to it, just a small, almost thoughtful look. Sometimes, she said quietly, life doesn't ask what you should or shouldn't do. He held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a slight nod. There was respect there now, clear and real, not because of who she was or what she did for a living, but because of what he had just witnessed. Around them, the restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm. Orders resumed, conversations restarted, and the soft sounds of movement filled the space again. But something had changed, even if it wasn't visible, even if it wasn't spoken. The moment stayed with everyone who had seen it. And as she turned back to her work, carrying the tray toward another table, one thing was clear. She was no longer invisible, and she never had been. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The lights were still soft, the tables still full, and the quiet hum of conversation had come back. Yet something had shifted in a way no one could ignore. She moved between the tables again, carrying plates, pouring drinks, doing everything she had been doing before. But now people noticed her, not in an uncomfortable way, in a different way. Some guests gave small smiles as she passed. Others looked at her with quiet respect, like they were still thinking about what they had just seen. A few even said soft thank yous that felt more genuine than before. She responded the same way she always did, with calm politeness, but inside, something felt different. Not overwhelming, not confusing, just lighter, as if something she had been carrying for years had finally shifted. At the center table, the man hadn't left yet. His meal sat mostly untouched now, though he didn't seem to notice. His attention followed her movements across the room, not in a demanding way, but thoughtfully. He wasn't watching a waitress anymore. He was watching someone he didn't fully understand yet. And that stayed with him. After a few minutes, he stood up again. This time, there was no hesitation in his steps. He walked toward the manager, who quickly straightened, unsure of what to expect. "I'd like to speak with her again," he said quietly. The manager nodded, glancing toward her before signaling gently. She noticed and made her way over, setting her tray down before approaching. Her expression was calm, the same as before. She didn't seem nervous or overly curious, just present. "You called?" she asked simply. He nodded once. "Yes." There was a short pause, not awkward, just thoughtful. He seemed to be choosing his words more carefully this time. "That moment," he began, glancing briefly toward the piano. "That wasn't something small." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she waited. He continued, his tone steady but different from before. "I've seen a lot of performances," he said, "in many places. Some very expensive, very well known. But what you did, that stayed." His words weren't dramatic. They were simple, and that made them feel more real. She looked at him for a moment, then lowered her gaze slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of thought. "It used to be a big part of my life," she said quietly. "Used to be?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." There was a small pause again. He didn't rush to fill it. "Why did you stop?" he asked finally, his voice softer now. She took a slow breath, her eyes briefly moving toward the piano before returning to him. "Life," she said. Just one word, but it carried enough meaning. He understood more than he expected to. Not the details, not the full story, but the feeling behind it. Responsibilities, difficult choices, things that don't leave room for dreams, even when those dreams matter. He nodded slowly. "That happens," he said. She gave a faint, almost thoughtful smile. "Yes, it does." For a moment, they stood there in quiet understanding. Two very different lives, two very different paths. But in that moment, there was a small connection between them. Something simple, something human. He straightened slightly, his expression becoming more certain. "I don't think it's over," he said. She looked at him, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked. He glanced around the room for a second, then back at her. "I mean," he said carefully, "you don't lose something like that. Not really. It doesn't just disappear." She didn't answer immediately, because a part of her had always known that. She had just chosen not to think about it. "Maybe," she said softly. He shook his head slightly. "Not maybe." There was no pressure in his voice, just belief. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card. It was simple, clean, nothing flashy, but it carried weight. He held it out to her. "If you ever decide you want to return to it," he said, "call this number." She looked at the card but didn't take it right away. "What is it?" she asked. "A chance," he replied. She studied his face for a moment, as if trying to understand what he meant beyond the words. "I support projects," he added. "Music, talent, things that matter. Not for show. For real." His tone was steady. No arrogance. No hidden meaning. Just an offer. Slowly, she reached out and took the card. Felt light in her hand, but at the same time heavier than she expected. "I'm not promising anything," he said. "That's up to you." She nodded slightly. "I understand." Another small silence followed, but this one felt different. Not uncertain, not tense, just open. He gave a final nod, then stepped back. "I'm glad you sat down at that piano," he said. She looked toward it again, then back at him. "So am I," she replied quietly. He didn't say anything more after that. He turned and walked toward the exit, his steps calm, his expression thoughtful. This time, people noticed him less, because the focus had shifted, and he knew it. The door closed softly behind him, and the night outside continued as usual. Inside, she stood still for a moment, the card still in her hand. She looked down at it, her fingers lightly holding the edges. It was such a small thing, but it didn't feel small. Her eyes moved slowly back toward the piano. It sat there quietly just like before. But now it felt different. Closer. Like it was no longer something from her past. But something waiting. She didn't move toward it. Not yet. Instead, she slipped the card carefully into her apron pocket. Not hidden. Not forgotten. Just kept. Then she picked up her tray again and returned to her work. The night continued. Orders were taken. Plates were served. Conversations filled the air again. But for her, something had changed. Not loudly. Not suddenly. But deeply. She moved with the same calm steps, the same quiet focus. But now there was something else behind it. A small spark. A quiet possibility. And as the evening slowly came to an end, and the lights softened even more, one thing became clear. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something she had once left behind. And this time she might not walk away from it.